What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is February 3rd, 2025, about 11 p.m., where I'm at right now. And today we are doing our third part of our 9th book in our Book to React series. This is Slave Breeding, written by Gregory D. Smithers. The subtitle is Sex, Violence, and Memory in African American History. And this book is interesting in the sense that it is not a detailed retelling of the slave breeding that happened. It's not giving like instances where it was. This is more a collection of how the idea of slave breeding was perpetuated throughout American society and how that affected people who were both, pro-slavery, anti-slavery, and of course the people who were enslaved and their slave masters as well. And this is reflected in what we read yesterday when we completed chapter 1, and we were talking about the abolitionists, the people who were against slavery, and how they talked about slave breeding. Essentially, they were making the argument that the slave masters of the Deep South were breeding slaves in areas where there weren't good agriculture, like Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, et cetera, and sending those slaves to the Deep South. Essentially, if you had a plantation in Virginia, you weren't going to make a lot of money just growing potatoes, tobacco, cotton, and stuff. So why not just reproduce as many slaves as possible? In that chapter that we read, he quoted Thomas Jefferson, who said essentially like a slave woman who produces 10 children is worth more than the strongest black male that you could ever have on a plantation. And this is also reflected as well in the cover art of this book. This was a picture taken of enslaved people, 2 of them children at least, who were classified as the slaves you could buy in New Orleans. As you see on the cover here, we have a very dark-skinned young boy, a very, very light-skinned looking girl, and a girl as well who's very dark-skinned in the middle, who seems to be a bit older. And the abolitionists were saying, like, see, the slave masters, they're starting to even enslave white people to some degree, because this girl on the very, very far right could be considered white, right? And also on top of that, the abolitionists were saying, like, essentially the slave masters are going against the moral code that our nation, America, should have. Because the slave master, what is he doing? He's not, enslaving a bunch of people and then teaching them good Christian ethics. No, the slave master, after a long, hard day of, whipping on people and making them pick cotton, he's essentially going and cheating on his wife by sleeping with the black woman in the shed, producing children with those women, committing fornication, adultery, and bastardy when that woman gets pregnant and then sells that child off into slavery. What is that saying about our nation, right? So those were some of the ways the abolitionists talked about slave breeding. Going now to the comment section, Avery jumped into the chat and said, "This crazy. I actually was having a conversation about slave breeding yesterday." See, this is also another thing that why this book is important, because a lot of us, have ideas about what happened during slavery, but a lot of us don't exactly know, right? And it's important for us to look at the darker parts of our history as people who are descended from our ancestors who went through so much, to actually learn and reconcile what we went through. It makes us validate our existence. It makes us stronger as people. It makes us more knowledgeable about where we came from, what we went through, and how far we still have to go. You get what I'm saying? So there's a lot to uncover and unpack in this book. And I want to give a shout out to everybody who tuned in yesterday. Yesterday was one of the biggest live streams we've ever had on this channel. So shout out to everybody who tuned in for that. And yeah, shout out to everybody who also tuned in for the other books as well. White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South, Cyber Racism, Is the Turk a White Man, Afro-Pessimism, and all the other books that we've covered on this channel. And if you have a book that you think would be great for this series, put it in the comments section and we'll try to get into it. I have a long list of things I want to read for this channel, but this is one of them that I thought would be important for Black History Month. We're in the 3rd day of Black History Month, fellas. What have you done? We're in the 3rd day of Black History Month. What have you done? I plan on reading for all of the remaining days. What do we have? 25 days left in Black History Month. Probably going to be reading every day on live for Black History Month. So let's get into it. We're reading chapter 2, only chapter 2 today, Slavery, the Lost Cause in African American History. If you don't know what lost cause is, this is essentially, the people who were apologists for the Confederacy. They give all sorts of excuses and reasons why the Confederacy was either right, how the Civil War could have been avoided, why slavery wasn't that bad, or why slavery was not why the Confederates were fighting the Civil War, et cetera, et cetera. So let's get into it. And it starts like this. The American Civil War, which began in 1861 and ended in 1865, was a bloody watershed in American history. More than 600,000 Americans sacrificed their lives, Southern cities and towns were destroyed, and the nation was forced, as President Lincoln put it in his Gettysburg Address in 1863, to forge a new birth of freedom. Indeed, Lincoln, like many Americans, was looking ahead to a future without internecine warfare long before the Civil War concluded. But in looking ahead to this peaceful and prosperous future, Americans had to come to terms with their past. In particular, all Americans, black and white, pondered what the collective national history with slavery would mean to a future that, in theory, would rest on the principles of union, democracy, and the emancipation of all enslaved people. As the war ground to its conclusion in 1865, white Southerners became particularly active in memorializing what they believed had been the righteous cause of the South. Southerners such as Edward A. Pollard, the editor of the Richmond Examiner, contributed influential memoirs and popular histories of the Old South and the Civil War in the service of explaining the South's history. Pollard is worthy of attention because he typified the white South's attempts to frame how Americans remembered slavery, the war, and the birth of a postbellum white identity. Pollard, in other words, joined scores of white Southerners in debating what became known as the lost cause of Southern history. In his 1866 book, The Lost Cause, Pollard introduced readers to the idea that a failure of statesmanship and sectional animosity caused the South to secede in defense of states' rights, resulting in the Civil War. Southern reviewers were initially critical of the book's thesis. One reviewer, for example, accused Pollard of presenting historical misrepresentations that prompted a plea for reliable histories of the lost cause. Thus began a debate over the meaning of slavery in the decades after the Civil War, a debate that continued, some would argue, still continues well into the 20th century. And see, this is why we read these books, right? This is why, because I didn't know that the lost cause, very similar to Jim Crow, had an origin in one person, right? If you don't know Jim Crow, what we think of as segregation, or as a shorthand term for segregation, began with this person who was pretending to be a minstrel actor. You get what I'm saying? So yeah, Jim Crow started off as a joke. The guy here, Pollard, who wrote this book, The Lost Cause, was the creator of this idea of the lost cause of the South, that, the South was wronged by having the Civil War happen to them. All right. KL says, let's breed them, snow bunnies. Amen, brother. Shout out to KL as well. And shout out to everybody who tuned into probably the most famous book in the Book to React series, White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South. That book will probably be something I'll refer to a lot to. When anybody asks me, what book, Simon, should I pick up and read? I'm going to say White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South. That's such a great, good book. But shout out to KL, and shout out to everybody else out there who enjoys literature, who enjoys literacy, who enjoys reading and learning. And if you don't like learning, if you don't like education, don't come on this channel, because this is an educational channel. Let's continue here. Historians such as David Blight, Bruce Baker, and Tara Hunter have analyzed the legacy of slavery and the different meanings attached to the Civil War during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was an era in American history defined by the Reconstruction of the South, which began in 1865 and ended in 1877. The economic growth of the New South, of racial violence, the rise of Jim Crow segregation, and increasing flows of immigrants to the United States from Europe and Asia. In this context, the mythology of the lost cause emerged as the dominant narrative in American popular and scholarly discourse. David Blight defines the lost cause as a public memory characterized by images of the fallen soldier and a righteous political cause defeated only by superior industrial might. Slavery, much less the enslaved, figured peripherally in the historical saga that was the Old South and the lost cause of the Confederacy. Typically, one former Confederate reflected on the passing of the slave South and the Confederacy by stating, "One can't help regretting whatever it was that produced George Washington and a crowd of other men like him." See, this goes to show Southern white men hate America just like Simon Hill keeps it trill. I repeat, Southern white men hate America just like Simon Hill keeps it trill. America is the most wicked, evil, disgusting, vile nation that ever existed. And white men in the deep South, like where I come from in Louisiana, agree, because they would rather wave that Confederate flag than the American flag. They would rather salute Robert E. Lee than Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. I repeat, Louisiana radicalized me. Louisiana radicalized me. And if you're a white man in the deep South, you know you hate America too. Because only a white man can say some shit like, "God forbid that any George Washingtons be born again. God forbid that the founding fathers dare have these ideas about liberty and equality for all people." You hate America too if you really want to wave that Confederate flag. The same way I want to piss on and shit on the American flag. Let's continue here. Lost cause mythology constituted a culturally constructed framework for remembering the past and, more importantly, forgetting the unseemly aspects of Southern history. If violent and sexually explicit imagery appeared in lost cause mythology, it was usually to deny that practices like slave breeding ever existed. However, the sexual coercion and violence associated with slave breeding practices was remembered. Such memories lived on in the oral histories and memoirs of former abolitionists, amateur historians, and Black Americans, as we will see, where professional historians asserted that if sexual impropriety and excessive violence existed during slavery, it was at the instigation of formerly enslaved Black Americans. Amateur historians, former abolitionists, and African Americans constructed very different images of the slave South. Increasingly, if one wanted to avoid the racism that blighted professional historical narratives at the turn of the century, it was essential to turn to African American perspectives on slavery and the oral traditions and writings of Black America. Black Americans and those white authors who braved the opprobrium of fellow white citizens and large swaths of the historical profession drew from disparate threads of memory and imagination to insert historical narratives about slave breeding into America's collective past. I have to look up this word, opprobrium. Opprobrium. This is a very new word. Harsh chat. Hold on, because this is a good word. Harsh criticism or censure. Why not also learn some vocabulary words today, right? Harsh criticism or censure. All right, so Black Americans and those white authors who braved the harsh criticism or censure, opprobrium, of fellow white citizens and a large swath of the historical profession drew from disparate threads of memory and imagination to insert historical narratives about slave breeding into America's collective past. Narratives that focused on sexual exploitation and racial violence used slave breeding as a rhetorical device to either emphasize the brutality of slavery or, depending on one's perspective, to deny the severity of slavery's vicissitudes. In the late 19th century, the significance of slave breeding was very much a topic of popular and scholarly conversations. However, the dawning of a new century brought with it more objective, empirical, and scientific approach to professional history writing. This produced a narrowing of understanding about the past. Professional historians drew sweeping conclusions on the basis of economic data sets, legal and political sources, and demographic data. The result was a picture of slavery as a benign system of coerced labor, the plantation merely a school for the enslaved, and the Civil War a noble battle fought by white men over political principles. This was not only a sanitized version of America's racial past, it was grotesquely misleading. Black Americans recognized the flaws in this version of American history was misleading. Nothing reminded them of that deception more forcefully than narratives about slave breeding. White memories of slavery and slave breeding. Just 3 days after the famous Battle of Gettysburg, Charles Sumner, the abolitionist politician who denounced the harlot slavery in 1856 and earned a beating at the end of Preston Brooks' cane for his troubles, wrote an anxious letter to John Kirwan, an English congregational minister, and staunch abolitionist. In his letter dated July 6, 1863, Sumner urged Kirwan to maintain pressure on England's members of parliament for a declaration of support for President Lincoln and the Union. Sumner insisted that a failure to do otherwise would see the members of parliament run the risk of sanctioning the idea of slave breeding, slave trading government to flaunt in the face of civilization. To the relief of Sumner and abolitionists throughout the North, the battles of Vicksburg and Gettysburg in 1863 swung the fortunes of the war in the Union's favor and hastened the decline of the Confederacy. However, changes in the course of the war produced new anxieties. Questions about what to do with the Negro increasingly occupied the minds of abolitionists and lawmakers during the uncertain years of 1864, 1865, and 1866. During this tumultuous period, memories of sexual exploitation, reproductive manipulation, and the separation of slave families was expressed in a variety of sources and literary genres. In the autobiographical publications of former abolitionists, narratives about slave breeding justified past political activism. In the speeches, published essays, and memoirs of former slaves and Black abolitionists, slave breeding dramatically highlighted the righteousness of ending slavery. Okay, slave breeding dramatically highlighted the righteousness of ending slavery, but also emphasized how raw and painful recollections of slavery were to them. Government bureaucrats also wrote about the legacy of slave breeding in the reports. Federal officials sent by President Lincoln to assess the state of the war-ravaged South reported that former slaves, or freedmen as they were known at the time, informed them about the absence of chastity on the antebellum plantation. Reports of enslaved women being severely whipped for not coming to the quarters of the overseer or master for the purposes of prostitution were dutifully recorded. The Commissioner of Agriculture, reporting on Virginia in 1865, asserted that Virginians profited from the sale of tobacco, flour, and slaves. The capital invested in slave breeding, the commissioner concluded, has been a source of profit to the owner, while it has been worse than wasted to society at large. As the uncertain reconstruction of the Union began, memories of slave breeding circulated through different levels of American culture and society. A growing number of memoirists and abolitionist authors of popular history placed these memories in the public domain following the publication of their writings. In 1866, Horace Greeley typified the tone of abolitionist recollections. Sorry, I have a student texting me. So Horace Greeley typified the tone of abolitionist recollections. Greeley wrote of slavery's horrors, emphasizing the plight of slave girls who were not only daily sold on the auction blocks of New Orleans and constantly advertised in her journals as very nearly white, well-educated, and possessed of the rarest personal attractions. These girls and women, Greeley and fellow abolitionists reflected, were the products of slave breeding practices in the antebellum South. Greeley proved uncompromising in his recollections of the trade in human flesh, keeping the image of exploited slave girls and women at the forefront of American collective memory. Greeley republished one of his antebellum speeches in which he claimed that slave breeding for gain, deliberately proposed and systematically pursued, appears to be among the latest devices and illustrations of human depravity. Going now to the comments, KL says, I have 6 kids with 3 women, Lebanese, Italian, and Spanish. Shout out to you, KL, for whoever you are out there. Having children is a beautiful thing. I hope you're able to take care of all those children. And I also hope that you're also right to all of your baby mothers. So shout out to you, KL. Continuing here, the effort to shape the public's memory of slavery developed rapidly in the 1870s. Popular magazines such as Scribner's Monthly ran stories that echoed abolitionist claims about slaves being bred in the Upper South for sale in the Lower South. The pages of the New Englander and Yale Review added to the store of collective remembrance in a review of the intense political debates that unfolded over territorial expansion in the 1840s and 1850s. The review reminded readers of how slave breeding and slave trading interests demanded new territory to be peopled with slaves. And lest Americans forget that the link between slavery, slave breeding, and territorial expansion had been as much a moral question as a problem of politics and economy. The British Quaker abolitionist John Ashworth provided an unequivocal reminder from across the Atlantic. In an 1875 biography of Ashworth, Andrew Cowan Cowman reminded readers of how the British abolitionists had once intoned, America, perfidious and guilty slavery. America, perfidious and guilty America, slave buying, slave selling, slave breeding, and slave destroying America. I'm going to put that on a t-shirt. America, perfidious and guilty America, slave buying, slave selling, slave breeding, and slave destroying America. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, family. All right. Abolitionists, with the aid of sympathetic publishers and popular media, worked hard to justify their efforts to highlight the justness of their cause to end slavery and preserve their legacy. They worked even harder to remind American readers of the moral lessons that came out of the crusade to abolish the slave system. For instance, the Congregational minister and abolitionist Parker Pillsbury did his bit to keep the image of the Upper South as a slave breeding nursery in the forefront of the public's collective memory. Pillsbury, remembering the activism of one of the great anti-slavery apostles, William Lloyd Garrison, described antebellum Baltimore as a slave-breeding, slave-trading, and slave-holding city. More damning were the reminiscences of William Ellery Channing. Channing, ever critical of the slave-breeding states, added his condemnation for the compromise politics of the pre-war decades, particularly the Missouri Compromise, as little more than an inducement to slave breeding interests. By the 1880s and 1890s, former abolitionists had helped to shape what they thought was a relatively coherent public narrative about slavery's horrors. In their writings, abolitionists emphasized three historical factors. First, the assumption that the Upper South bred slaves for sale in the Lower South, and the Southwest echoed pre-war accusations. Second, the belief that the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade to the United States in 1808 provided a stimulus to slave breeding practices. And third, the conviction that compromise politics over territorial expansion, not sectional extremists on both sides, as lost cause mythologizers claimed, gave slave breeding and slave trading interests the pretext for manipulating slave reproduction. These three accusations became narrative staples in the memoirs of former abolitionists and in the reproduction of their antebellum speeches. A growing number of popular histories also highlighted these three factors in leveling the charges of slave breeding against the slave South. Henry Wilson's revised History of the Rise and Fall of the Slave Power in America relied almost exclusively on political speeches and antebellum pamphlets for its source base. Wilson also drew on Dew's study of the Virginia legislature in 1831 to 1832 to argue that when it is remembered that this, Dew's analysis, was not spoken in the heat of debate by a political partisan, but written by a cultivated, scholarly man in the calm retirement of his study, an educator, too, of young men in the venerable college of his state, discoursing on slave breeding and slave selling as if they were mere matters of political economy, precisely as he would write of raising stock and improved breeds of animals. Something of the moral tendency of the system he defends and advocates may be estimated. Wilson saw Dew's evidence as the proof needed to assert that slave breeding, tragically, had been a reality in the antebellum South. Basically, what they're trying to say here is that, this guy wrote about slave breeding, and he is not some, crazy, abolitionist with fire coming out of his eyes and his ears and his mouth, talking about how slavery is wicked. This is a guy who is measured and calm, et cetera, et cetera. And what they're talking about here is like after the end of slavery, when people are talking about the wickedness of the South and debating the legacy of the South, they're talking about how all these compromises that led up to the Civil War, like the Missouri Compromise, et cetera, were feeding into this beast of the slave masters continuing to want to replicate their capital and their property by forcing Black people to breed with each other, right? So, it's just more evidence laying to the claim that that slave breeding was actually real. I mean, common sense tells us it was so. Anyway, one of the most influential popular histories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was James Ford Rhodes' 4-volume History of the United States. Rhodes, a prominent industrialist, avid historian, and conservative Democrat, published Volume 1 of the history in 1892. He observed that American territorial expansion, beginning with Jefferson's 1803 purchase of the the Louisiana Territory had been pivotal in the South's drive for slavery's extension and the emergence of slave breeding practices. In the antebellum South, Rhodes argued slavery is a blessing and cotton is king. But for the blessing to continue, territorial expansion was an absolute necessity. This led Rhodes to the conclusion that a synergy between territorial expansion, economic greed, and Southern racism produced an overwhelming motivation for slave breeding. He concluded that had it not been for the new cotton planters' demand for Negroes, which made slave breeding a profitable industry for the border states, Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky, would never have gone into the business of breeding human beings for profit. So yeah, this is a conservative at the time. Like a Democrat back then was the right-wing, racist old white man on a rocking chair, right? So yeah, he was talking about in his, book that's almost well over 100 years old, of the history of the United States. James Ford Rhodes was talking about, yeah, slave breeding was profitable. And this is a person who probably had some very racist views and would not deny that, that Black people to some degree were inferior to white men. Continuing here, Rhodes based his dark conclusions on abolitionist literature, popular periodicals such as North American Review and DeBow's Review, and the memoirs and published journals of former slaves and prominent Southerners. He used these sources to portray slave breeding as an article of established historical fact and popular knowledge. True to his sources and to Victorian sexual morality, Rhodes highlighted the disproportionate suffering inflicted on enslaved women because of slave breeding practices. He argued that the institution of slavery bore harder on the women than on the men. Slave breeding formed an important part of plantation economy being encouraged and was the breeding of animals. As was the breeding of animals. Rhodes expressed indignation for those slave owners and traders who partook in the degradation of human life in the quest for economic gain. Profits that Rhodes argued came in the form of cash returns from the sale of human beings and cotton crops. Rhodes reiterated this point when he claimed, when it became known that they, enslaved women, were pregnant, their task was lightened, yet if necessary, they were whipped when with child, and in some cases were put to work again as early as 3 weeks after confinement, although generally the time of rest allowed was 1 month. The image of slaves being coerced to reproduce children and engorge the profits of slave owners and slave traders was bad enough, but the idea that successive generations of slaves were reproduced like animals clearly horrified Rhodes. By the time he leveled his historical accusations against the slave South, however, professional historians had grown uneasy, even disbelieving about the reality of slave breeding practices. But before these historians could analyze data sets and lift their pens to join lost cause mythologizers in crafting coherent narratives that erase slave breeding from collective historical memory, the popular recollections of abolitionists and histories of slave breeding by amateur historians like Rhodes served important historical and social scientific purposes. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American popular and intellectual culture was punctuated by repeated references to nature, evolution, and human fitness. These were the buzzwords in the historical arsenal of social Darwinian and eugenic thinkers. In the context of remembering slave breeding, then, this scientific discourse highlighted how slavery fostered unnatural sexual relationships between male and female slaves, and more specifically, how white men engaged in unnatural acts of exploitation with enslaved women. In an evolutionary sense, former abolitionists and sympathetic historians portrayed these illicit plantation encounters as harmful to the moral fiber of the Southern body politic and destructive to the progressive evolution, the survival of the fittest of a white American civilization. As noted above, a new generation of professional historians entered this social and cultural context and drafted histories of slavery that continue to influence popular memories of slavery in the 21st century. Viewing themselves as scientists of historical analysis, professional historians turned to the empirical records and memories of former slave owners. These were sources scholars believed they could trust. They were, after all, bequeathed to posterity by some of the most respectable white men in the South. turn of the century historians never seriously questioned whether the family members of former slave owners or slave traders might have purged or conveniently lost unflattering evidence of sexual exploitation and violence before depositing plantation records in some of America's great university libraries. Safe in the knowledge that these archives contain the written facts about slavery's past, historians systematically dissected plantation records. Professional historians, an overwhelmingly white and male profession at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, insisted that the sources they drew from to recreate the past were far more objective and trustworthy than the face-saving reminiscences of former abolitionists and unreliable memories of former slaves, and the propaganda of the African-American historian Carter G. Woodson and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Going now to the comments, Brian C. says hello. Shout out to Brian C. Salute to you and salute to everybody in the chat. If you're tuning in, let me know what you think about these paragraphs. Let me know what you think about these chapters. Let me know what books you think we should be reading next in the Booked React series. Let's continue here. However, just to be sure that professional historians did not misinterpret the facts contained in the country's archival repositories, former slave owners added their voices to the public contest over the meaning of slavery and the Civil War. By the way, I have to say this, I find this endlessly fascinating that slave owners, when slavery ended, they submitted their records to, great libraries, universities, historians, to go over this and save it for posterity. But they also might have omitted information that they committed crimes against humanity, right? In America, we never had truth and reconciliation like they had in South Africa, or like other places that have gone through genocide and really vicious war crimes against people. We haven't really had that in America when it comes to slavery, right? So I find this fascinating, right? And I wonder if those people who were slave owners, might have ripped out the page that said, hey, we were purposely impregnating Black women and selling our own children into slavery down in New Orleans, right? Like, I wonder if they ripped out those pages because they thought maybe we're going to be on trial one day. Maybe there's going to be some justice done against us for what we have committed against these people who we unhumanized, who we depersonified. You get what I'm saying? Anyway, continuing here. However, just to be sure that professional historians did not misinterpret the facts contained in the country's archival repositories, former slave owners added their voices to the public contest over the meaning of slavery and the Civil War. Former slave owners portrayed slavery as a benign institution. Writing in the New England magazine in 1891, M.V. Moore, a former slave owner, expressed his determination to move beyond what he saw as the polemical tenor of abolitionist recollections. Moore insisted that he wanted to express a common sense account of slavery. He did so by recalling his own moral shock at being confronted with the sight of the slave auction block. He wrote, "I shall never forget my first impression of the horrors of slavery, my first knowledge of the existence of those horrors. It was a great event, not only in my history, but in the history of the neighborhood. Also, that big sale of likely Negro men and women." Very interesting. I mean, this is a person who owned slaves saying that he was aghast. He was horrified. He was mortified by the sight of human beings on an auction block. And then he said, I'll take two of them. 50 for the big buck over there. Like how can, it's funny how people can be so complex, right? This is why I always say, right, like it doesn't matter who people sleep with, who your friends are. One of the most bothersome things is that white people say is like, I can't be racist. I have a Black friend. There were white people who had Black friends during slavery. You get what I'm saying? Like this was a man who owned Black people during slavery saying, I felt morally aghast and shocked when I saw people on sale. And yet I did it anyway. And I think that also reflects on us now as well. We live in societies all over the world. It could be America, it could be Hungary, it could be any country where something horrible is happening right now. And we say, that's terrible. How can I let this happen? And yet, and still we let that happen anyway. You get what I'm saying? Just taking it even simpler. A lot of us eat meat. I eat chicken, I eat beef, I eat all meats, right? You get what I'm saying? Pause. And yet we know, like at these slaughterhouses, these animals are kept in cages, this, 3x4. You get what I'm saying? They don't have the ability to move around. And we say that's horrible. Why do we allow this to happen? And yet and still we eat KFC, McDonald's, all that stuff. You get what I'm saying? So yeah, anyway, continuing here. Moore's memory of slavery was not framed by the enforced labor, brutal punishments, unbalanced diets, or sexual exploitation of slaves. Instead, he framed the slave traders and auctioneers as the immoral historical actors who sold slaves and separated families. In Moore's rendering, slave owners, like the slaves, were history's victims. Okay, that's ridiculous. This is ridiculous. It's always funny when white men who are the perpetrators of vicious things always try to pass the buck on to somebody else. Yeah, I own slaves, but I'm not the problem. It was the slave trader. Why did you sell me slaves? This is like saying if a woman is addicted to crack, right? And she says like, I'm not the problem that my kids can't eat, or, I'm living out on the streets. You get what I'm saying? And my kids don't have shoes on their feet. You get what I'm saying? It's not my fault. It's the drug dealer's fault. On one hand, yes, it's the drug dealer's fault for like selling drugs in his own community and hurting people and stuff like that. But where's the personal responsibility? Everybody wants to take personal responsibility except rich white men who commit horrible acts of violence and acts of depravity against other people. I cannot believe what I'm reading here. A slave owner, a man who owned slaves, said, I wasn't the perpetrator of evil. It was the slave trader who sold me the slaves. And I had no choice. I had no choice but to buy 100 Negroes and whip them and beat them. I had no choice. It was all forced upon me, my poor, helpless white hands. Come on now. Anyway, Moore was not alone in these claims. Robert Quaterman Mallard, for example, recalled that slave masters worked tirelessly to instill religion and morality in slaves. Slave owners did this, Mallard remembered, to prevent open immorality. To professional historians, such recollections made perfect sense. Late 19th and early 20th century historians viewed this impressionistic evidence as supportive of more reliable evidence, such as economic and population data sets, plantation logbooks, and slave auction records. What did these facts reveal? These conclusions that professional historians arrived at were strikingly different from those of former abolitionists and amateur historians. The scholarship of William Archibald Dunning, a Columbia University historian, epitomized the tenor of professional history writing at the turn of the century. The Dunning School of Historical Interpretation gave scholarly credibility to sanitized histories of slavery, with kindly paternal slave masters tending to the needs of their slaves, and to memories of Reconstruction as an era defined by white carpetbaggers and inept Black politicians. Dunning characterized Reconstruction as a travesty of civilized government. His Jesus Christ. Slavery wasn't bad. It was just all that stuff we were doing after slavery ended, right? Like the Freedmen's Bank trying to promise Black people 40 acres and a mule. That was a travesty. That was a travesty against mankind, not slavery, right? Anyway. All right, his criticism of Reconstruction governments expressed his own racial and aristocratic class biases, and with it, a lament for the Old South that disappeared when the Union Army defeated the South during the Civil War. According to Dunning, the ambitious Northern whites, inexperienced Southern whites, and unintelligent Blacks engaged in corrupt or economically dubious forms of government spending. In fact, the abolition of slavery meant that state governments now had to administer justice and education and assist in the regulation of formerly enslaved families, tasks previously performed by the slave master. These new governmental tasks, Dunning contended, swelled state budget deficits and amounted to special privileges for Blacks, the chief beneficiaries of the new system, that were unavailable to whites. At the turn of the century, then, the Civil War had come to represent a bloody and tragic period in American history. In its place stood, momentarily, a corrupt and immoral regime headed by unscrupulous whites and feckless Blacks. Insane. I mean, Reconstruction is one of those moments in history that we can always wonder, like, what if? What if Black people got 40 acres and a mule? What if white folks did not destroy the Freedmen's Bank? What if, we didn't just jump straight into sharecropping afterwards and essentially become slaves again all over, right? basically have American medieval peonage on land, right? What if we didn't have that? What if we didn't have that? Reconstruction is one of those what ifs. But in the minds of the people who were the former slave masters, and still in the minds of the white supremacists who run America today, mostly in the Republican Party, but generally in both, they tend to think, you know what, Reconstruction was one of the worst things that ever happened. How dare they come down and try to force white people to treat black people equally? How dare they come down and try to force black men to have the right to vote? How dare they do that? How dare they do that? Insane. And let's continue here. African-American memories of slavery and slave breeding. From the closing years of the Civil War to the emergence of the Dunning School of Historical Interpretation, African Americans constructed their own oral histories, literary traditions, and scholarly interpretations about slavery's violence and sexual excesses. Indeed, the violent white resistance to Reconstruction politics in the South, the rise of Jim Crow segregation, and the racialization of lynching after the Civil War kept memories of the traumatic days of slavery burning brightly in the minds of millions of Black Americans. The emotional pain of family separations and the memory of sexual exploitation was repeated in the narratives of the freedmen during the final years of the Civil War and the initial years of freedom. Former female slaves never forgot the overwhelming feelings of despair and depression that descended on them after being separated from loved ones. Slave owners and slave traders had a variety of motives for selling and separating enslaved family members, but framing this separation around the trope of slave breeding highlighted feelings of powerlessness and despair and expressed the inhumanity that freedmen associated with slavery. Maddie Jackson remembered the emotional pain she experienced after being forcibly parted from her mother. Coupled with a brutal beating at the hands of a cruel white overseer, Jackson remembered losing her appetite and not being able to take enough food to sustain nature. I became so weak, I had but little strength to work. These were deeply painful memories, but through the pain shone stories of resilient parents and strong families. Friedman recalled, for instance, that parental role models instilled a strong sense of loyalty to family and an even stronger moral sense of right and wrong during slavery. Elizabeth Delaney, writing in 1863 of Cursed Slavery, expressed the links that many freedmen made between freedom and family solidarity. When my father was sold south, she recalled, my mother registered a solemn vow that her children should not continue in slavery all their lives, and she never spared an opportunity to impress upon us that we must get our freedom whenever the chance offered. Like so many enslaved women, Jackson and Delaney echoed abolitionist claims that slave owners and slave traders cruelly separated Black families, treated like cattle, and violently plunged into a melancholy that only freedom and the establishment of family bonds could remedy. Jackson and Delaney provided readers in 1860s America with a reminder of just how inhuman the manipulation of slave reproductive and family life was under slavery. Such narratives opened a window into the feelings of sorrow, of misery, and anguish that the slaves had previously hidden from their tormentors. Now that slavery was no more, Black Americans were determined to expose the horrors of slavery and actively contest the distortions of the lost cause and the racism of professional historical writing. So once again, I think this is very important. After slavery, many people were dealing with the post-traumatic stress that they went through, all the pain that they experienced during slavery. And instead of just keeping that in, instead of just wallowing in the grief, they decided to share it and talk about it. Not everybody, but a lot of people. And this is what I say all the time. It's important. If you're watching this right now, whoever you are, wherever you are, write your story. Tell your story, especially if you're a Black man. Especially if you're a Black man, especially if you're a Black man. If you're a Black man right now, listening to me, write your story, record your story, videotape your story, because it's important that our voices are heard through generations. Because you know what the white folks are going to do? The people that hate our guts, the people that detest us, they're going to tell our story for us. And they're going to say, you know what? The niggas are the problem. And that's not what we want our children to remember. That's not what we want the new world that will come after this one to remember us as. It's important because the people that went through the worst that our people have ever gone through told their stories. And no matter how painful it was, no matter how many family separations they went through, no matter how many people were forced to breed, they told their stories. And we should be doing the same. I just want to put that out there, man, because this is something so important that I stress on this channel. Let's continue here. So, two of the most enduring fictions to emerge in lost cause mythology were the trope of the chivalrous white Southern male and the dutiful and asexual white woman. Looking back over their enslavement, former slaves struggled to recall such individuals. Instead, freedmen exposed the sexual hypocrisy that they believed was the cornerstone of Southern culture prior to the Civil War. For example, Louisa Piquet's autobiography described her fair complexion and rosy cheeks, dark eyes, flowing head of hair with no perceptible inclination to the curl, and every appearance at first view of an accomplished white lady. For slaves who penned their life stories during the 1860s, men and women of Piquet's physical appearance embodied the enduring legacy of forced breeding practices. In the fourth edition of his memoir, 22 Years a Slave, 1867, Austin Stewart gave voice to this perspective. The time has passed by when African blood alone is enslaved, he wrote. In Virginia, as well as in some other slave states, there is as much European blood in the veins of the enslaved as there is African, and the increase is constantly in favor of the white population. This fact speaks volumes and should remind the slave-breeding Southerner of that fearful retribution which must sooner or later overtake him. Retribution, according to William Still, had commenced during the pre-Civil War decades when enslaved men, women, and children absconded from the slave plantation along the Underground Railroad. Still was an influential African-American conductor of the Philadelphia Underground Railroad, shepherding hundreds of runaway slaves into freedom. During the 1870s, Still, like scores of former slaves and Black abolitionists, published suspenseful tales of life on the Underground Railroad. These narratives were replete with references to reproductive manipulation, violence, and family separations. In publishing the Recollections of Runaway Slaves, Still made a significant contribution to an African-American narrative of slavery that directly challenged lost cause hagiography. The slave auction block, Still reported in the 1872 edition of the Underground Railroad, inspired slaves to risk life and limb and flee for freedom. The horrors of the auction block were often said to be the cruelest of the slave-breeding South's tools, trading in human flesh, exploiting human beings like cattle, and resulting in the daily heartbreaking separations of enslaved family members. The story of Mary Epps highlighted the emotional wrench caused by the auction block. Still recounted that Epps, about 45 years of age, dark complexion, round built, and intelligent, fled from enslavement in Petersburg, Virginia, in the mid-1850s. Virginia was reputed by abolitionists to be a notorious slave-breeding state, and the fact that Mary had given birth to 15 children, 4 of whom had been sold away from her, one was still held in slavery in Petersburg, the others were all dead, meant that she had reached a point in her life when she could no longer endure the physical and psychological terror associated with the reproductive demands on her body. Moreover, Mary's fecundity was evidently a product of sexually exploitative slave master. Mary's mistress suffered from intense feelings of jealousy and betrayal because of her husband's lusting after Mary. According to Still, Mary recalled that her mistress, being of a jealous disposition, caused me to be hired out with a hard family, where I was much abused, frequently flogged, and stinted for food. If Mary was the object of the unwanted sexual advances of her master, which his wife clearly wanted stopped, her hiring out led to physical abuse of inhuman proportions. But it was the sale of one of her children, Still informed readers, that so affected Mary with grief that she was thrown into violent convulsions, which caused the loss of her speech for 1 entire month. Mary's only way out of this nightmare world was death or flight. With Still's help, she chose the latter. Thank God. See, this is horrible, man. This is horrible. Like, reading this story damn near makes me want to cry. Like, I couldn't imagine being a woman, right? 45 years old, standing on the auction block. You were forced to give birth to multiple children by your slave master. Your slave master ends up selling yours and his children into slavery. And the last child that you have with you in your possession, they rip that one away from you, and you scream and you want to, get your child back, and you end up losing your voice, man. And then on top of that, the woman who is married to the slave master that keeps on raping you is jealous of you and then forces you to go work at this other plantation where the people just whip you and beat you and all sorts of stuff. This is horrible. This is hell on earth, man. And once again, shout out to Mary Epps for surviving all of that, and what a powerful story that she had. But this is American history, baby. This is American history. Let's continue. In heartbreaking and chillingly graphic detail, the narratives of former slaves like Mary Epps were direct and unflinching challenges to lost cause mythology and professional historical accounts of slavery. Slaves were not, as white memoirists and professional historians insisted, happy. The enslaved were abused and exploited and utterly manipulated. But most slaves did not passively accept their physical exploitation and psychological degradation. For example, the former slaves James Green recalled running away from the yoke of Joshua Hitch. Hitch was allegedly a morally bankrupt individual, and according to Green's account, a lousy businessman. Forced to sell his 4 slaves, 3 of whom were women, 2 being sisters, and all considered Hitch's wives, Green ran away from this sordid environment using the Underground Railroad to find his way to freedom. African-American narratives of escape along the Underground Railroad connected memories of unspeakable exploitation with the quest for freedom. That so many slaves narrated escapes from the Upper South, states notorious for their alleged involvement in slave breeding schemes, served to highlight the yawning moral gulf between slavery and freedom, morality and immorality, in African-American memories of enslavement. The post-war narrative of former slaves and Black abolitionists thus spoke matter-of-factly of how slave breeding for the Southern market was extensively carried out in Virginia, Kentucky, and other border states. Slave traders made frequent trips through this section, and their coming brought the consternation, distress, and separation to many a slave family. Slave breeding and other coercive sexual practices produced a post-war African-American population that was a kaleidoscope of colors, a diversity of tints and hues that was, in African-American narratives, a mark of the less than noble slave South. While many former slaves internalized feelings of shame and found it difficult to talk about their memories of slavery, others attempted to give historical meaning to such recollections. Still, other Black Americans tried to put the terrors of slavery behind them by finding loved ones and legitimating marriages that had no legal standing under slave law. Taken together, the silence, narrative, remembering, and actions of late 19th and early 20th century African Americans presented a version of slavery that challenged the emerging white historical consensus. Henry Clay Bruce said it best when he wrote in his memoir that immoral white men have, by force, injected their blood into our veins to such an extent that we now represent all colors, from pure Black to pure white. For African Americans who shared Bruce's take on American history, the idea that we are what they, white slaveholders, made us, spoke volumes for the enduring legacy of violent sexual exploitation in the antebellum South. Thus, while the presence of a physically diverse African-American population reminded Blacks of the coercive power that white masters, overseers, and slave traders once exercised over them, the narratives that these former slaves crafted were meant to highlight to whites the immoral nature of slavery and the sexual hypocrisy that was at the heart of most white historical narratives. No historical trope emphasized this point more clearly than slave breeding. So essentially what they're trying to say is like, as shameful, well, it shouldn't be shameful, but as painful as it is to know that you are, light-skinned, or we as Black Americans don't look exactly like, Black Africans that come from Africa because of the, rape that happened to our great-great-great-great-grandmothers and stuff like that. And that some of us are red, some of us are light, and et cetera, because of that. The people who were formerly enslaved know a lot of that happened because of the sexual violence exploitation that happened to Black women, and also explicitly because of slave breeding. But instead of hiding that and making that considered shameful, they embrace that, acknowledge that, and use that to say, we are like this, and that should be a testament to how wicked and immoral you are. And I personally think that a lot of the racism or anti-Blackness that exists in America specifically, but possibly around the world in other contexts and places, stems from because when white folks see us, they realize their sin. You get what I'm saying? When they see us, they know their sin. And I'm not saying not all of them know that consciously at a front of lobe type level, but like in a back of the mind type level, they know when they see us, they're seeing people, who have gone through hell because of them. You get what I'm saying? And it might not be specifically them who are standing in front of you right now, but it could be their ancestors, their fathers, their great-grandfathers, et cetera, their mothers, their great-grandmothers, et cetera, because we're not letting women off the hook too. You get what I'm saying? So I think that's part of the reason, like there's still that animosity in America towards Black people, obviously, as we see through this administration we're living under right now. But continuing here, by the 1880s and 1890s, then a significant number of African Americans published revealing portrayals of slave breeding practices. These accounts included descriptions of slavery that were reminiscent of the sensational passages found in the anti-slavery writings of Black Americans before the Civil War. For example, John P. Green's Recollections, 1880, emphasized how hard it had been for the poor slaves to be bought and sold at auction and separated from their parents and children and husbands and wives, and it was awfully cruel to whip them so. Such narratives confronted readers with firsthand recollections of slave owners manipulating the reproductive lives of slaves through interference in courtship, marriage, and reproduction, and through the threat of family separation on the auction block. African American men and women published accounts about this manipulation, although a growing number of Black middle-class women turned increasingly to writings that fostered a cult of respectability among young African Americans. Black men, however, remained as critical of slave breeding as they became of the sexual exploitation and rape of Black domestics after the Civil War. The former slave Friday Jones recalled that his mother was traded for a tract of land and sent to Alabama. Jones was hired out as a young man and claimed that he developed no sense of communal belonging. His religious faith steeled him against the cruelties of the slave South, and so too did his longing for the intimate, emotional, and physical connection that comes with marriage. When Jones fell in love with a woman on a plantation whom his master did not own and who gave birth to 11 children, Jones's owner threatened him with sale. But Jones persisted because I had all the craves for a wife and children, and I feel today that God gave me that woman to take care of. After winning his bride, however, Jones recognized that he and his family were not safe from the coercive and manipulative practices of slave owners and slave traders. He recalled, whenever there were traders in the country, I never felt safe with my wife and children. Jones eventually did lose his family on the auction block. In 1856, 2 of his sons were sold. Shortly thereafter, he and his wife were sold to a new master, a man who promised never to separate them. See what a lie men will tell, Jones angrily reported, because a short time after that, he sold my wife and youngest child for as much as he gave for the 4. In the minds of former slaves like Jones, this type of manipulation was the most demoralizing aspect of slavery. Jones recalled, I became so uneasy and troubled I could not work. His anxiety about the welfare of his wife and family endured during the final days of slavery, the Civil War, and into the post-war decades. Indeed, his memories of slavery's brutalizing qualities presaged an even more brutally racist world after slavery had been abolished. As Jones put it, how often have mortals been whipped to death and no one near to help or pity them? How horrible for a man to stand and see his wife whipped and her wounds bathed in salt water and not be able to protect her. Today, some of our race are not doing much better. The exploitative ways in which enslaved men and women had their reproductive lives manipulated by slave owners and slave traders bounded off the pages of African American memoirs and reminiscences after the Civil War. While men like Friday Jones recalled the feelings of emasculation that came with their inability to protect enslaved women from sexual abuse or to prevent the separation of family members, formerly enslaved men did not lose sight of the fact that the psychological and physical toll of slave breeding practices bore hardest on enslaved women. Alan Parker remembered witnessing the heartbreak of slave mothers in Louisville, Kentucky. Using an anti-slavery song to express the rawness of the emotions he witnessed, Parker wrote, "Oh, deep was the anguish of the slave mother's heart when called from her darling forever to part. So grieved that lone mother, that broken-hearted mother in sorrow and woe. The child was borne off to a far distant clime, while the mother was left to anguish and pine. But reason departed, and she sank broken-hearted in sorrow and woe. Postbellum references to abolitionist songs, poems, and political literature added interpretive layers to the public manner in which African Americans remembered slavery. For example, the Black nationalist Alexander Crummell emphasized the centrality of reproductive manipulation and violence against people of African descent in the American South. Crummell argued that the Negro contingent was one of the earliest contributions to the American population. Evidence of this contribution, Crummell contended, was found in the racially mixed populations in America's towns and cities. In Crummell's mind, such populations were the products of the gross and violent intermingling that occurred in the plantation South and should not be taken as an index for consensual sexual relations between white men and enslaved women. Attempting to reclaim the moral high ground for Black masculinity in an age when Black men had the vilest of aspirations cast on their sexuality. Vilest of aspersions, not aspirations, had the vilest of aspersions cast on his sexuality. Crummell demanded that it was, in fact, the depravity and hypocrisy of white men that had produced mixed race populations. Intermixture of blood there has been, Crummell thundered, not by amalgamation, which implies consent, but through the victimizing of the helpless Black woman. I mean, Malcolm X, said it best. I charge the white man with being the greatest drunkard on the planet, the greatest woman beater on the planet, the greatest rapist on the planet. I mean, these are quotes directly from Malcolm X. And if I'm not saying exactly right, I'm paraphrasing it. But yeah, they label Black men all these things, that we're these sexual deviants, when literally there are 40 million Black Americans, like 25% of our DNA is white because of the rampant rape done to our great-great-great-grandmothers because of rampant sexual violence done by white men, right? You cannot say the same thing in inverse for Black men, right? And let's continue. Crummell was not the only Black minister of African-American Crummell was not the only Black minister or African-American intellectual to point out the immoral nature of the white South's history. Black ministers combined biblical commentary, history lessons, and moral lectures to emphasize how slavery and slave breeding practices treated the Negro like an animal. Speaking in Columbia, South Carolina in 1899, Reverend R.F. Hurley placed American history in a biblical context, arguing that the relation of master and slave was a corruption of the natural ordering of the universe as God had ordained it. Drawing loosely on the social Darwinian rhetoric that had come to pervade American culture at the turn of the century, Hurley instructed that the creation of a false aristocracy founded upon property and man undermined the natural equality of humankind. To emphasize his point, Hurley used the metaphor of childhood, arguing that the coerced enslavement of Africans in North America spoiled the innocence and helplessness of the African and inhibited the moral development of all humanity in the United States. Hurley argued that the unnaturalness of the master-slave relationship undermined the moral core of American society, marriage and stable family life. In particular, courtship and marriage were conducted largely with reference to the slave owner's lust for profit. This was the awful wrong of human slavery. Hurley insisted that the slave owner's manipulation of courtship and marriage had far-reaching implications, throwing its dark form across every phase of social life, blighting the pulpit and the pew, perverting the gospel and the law, and transferring God's oldest institution, marriage, from its heaven-appointed foundation, love, to the hell-born consideration of ownership in man. But not all was lost. While memory of past injustices should not be forgotten, Hurley suggested that his Black congregants adopt a scientific approach to rectifying the ills of historical wrongs. Combining social Darwinian language with the rhetoric of racial destiny, Hurley explicitly engaged with memories of slavery. He argued that the mere forgetting of sins committed will never place us beyond the awful consequences. This was a challenge to our duty to counteract as far as possible the evil results of past mistakes. He explained that to correct the enduring effects of those wrongs, we should, like the physician, study the cause of present conditions. The only way to conduct such analysis effectively, Hurley declared, was by lifting the curtain from the face of the past, even when that past be dark and revolting in every aspect. And I agree. And, as he added, taking hold of the roots of the awful contagion, which throws its threatening shadow across the path of posterity, blunting its power of perception, stupefying its moral sense, and easing or weakening its consciousness of right. To a certain extent, a growing number of African American intellectuals, most of them men, did lift the curtain from the face of the past and confront the historical significance of slavery and reproductive manipulation in the slave South. The ways in which Black scholars both drew from and shaped memories of slave breeding to explore larger issues pertaining to violence and sex will be explored in greater detail in the next chapter. For now, it is worth noting that Black scholars, educators, and social commentators knew that they had to tread a fine line between exposing the past for what millions of African Americans remembered or imagined it to be, on the one hand, and emphasizing a message of uplift, the cult of respectability, and racial destiny on the other. The African American educator Kelly Miller focused his historical reflections on the false notions of political economy that resulted in trading human beings as though they were livestock. Others, such as Benjamin W. Arnett, a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, recognized that the memories of slavery were too painful for many Black Americans to relive. Speaking before the Afro-American League of Tennessee's Emancipation Day celebrations in 1894, Arnett urged his audience to look to the future, exclaiming, "We are not here to revive the unpleasant memories of the past, nor to rekindle the campfires which are possessions of the dead past, but we are here to crown the head of him, Lincoln, from the fullness of whose great heart the Second Declaration of Independence sprung." In trying to peer into the future and lay out a roadmap for the destiny of the African American people, Arnett's speech was punctuated with subtle reminders of the legacies of slave breeding practices. Arnett may have wanted the past to be dead, but he knew that the effects of slavery endured. Like so many clerics, scholars, and community leaders, Arnett could not ignore the gradations of color that existed among African Americans. Indeed, the sense of powerlessness that enslaved men recalled in being unable to protect wives and daughters from white male sexual exploitation during slavery was, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, seemingly replicated in the sexual abuses of African American women who worked in white homes as domestics, and in the lynch mobs that targeted Black men with the hangman's noose and the castrator's blade. Strikingly, the vast majority of the public statements made by Black Americans about slave breeding during the late 19th and early 20th centuries were made by men. The cult of dissemblance that Darlene Clark Hine identifies in African American women's public statements about sex and sexuality meant that Black women exercised circumspection when it came to such matters, especially in the company of whites. This is not to suggest that Black women did not discuss sexual matters. They did. Ida B. Wells, for example, refused to shy away from issues of sex, particularly interracial sex and rape, in her campaign against lynching. But the cult of respectability that dissemblance fostered among Black women, especially middle-class Black women, meant that they challenged racial and sexual stereotypes by teaching young Black Americans the efficacy of cultivating a positive self-image, living good moral lives, and being attentive mothers. So I think what he's trying to say here is that Black men, after the end of slavery, right, to some degree, they felt cucked. Black men, to some degree, and even still now, we're not full men in the sense that we cannot fully enact patriarchy to the level that white men can. White men are the only ones who can claim to be full men in the sense that they can have the full benefits and advantages of being men in a white supremacist patriarchal world. Maybe there are patriarchal societies where, in fact, no, I take that back. Yes, in every society, white men are the only ones capable of being full patriarchal men, even if the society is all Black, right? Because we live in a white supremacist world. There is no place in this world without white supremacy. So, of course, white men will be able to enact full patriarchy. But anyway, going back here to the 19th century, right? Yeah, this Black man who's talking about, we're not here to talk about the past, still is talking about how, Black people come in many different shades and colors, and that's a symbol, that's a reflection of the sexual violence that was enacted against Black women, against Black men who wanted to take wives, but their wives were raped by master, right? And, it shows like to some degree Black men were cucked, and that still bothers us And maybe a lot of Black men were talking about slave breeding because it's a sensitive topic in the sense that we weren't able to get that blood revenge that white men were able to get whenever one of their women were taken advantage of, right? And Black women didn't talk about slave breeding and sexual exploitation because it's always considered improper for women to be talking about sexuality in public, right? Let's continue here. In other words, Black women found alternative ways to publicly address the legacy of slave breeding in African American culture. Historian Michelle Mitchell observes that Black women such as Sylvia Bryant instructed young African Americans that they should endeavor to avoid disorderly homes, immorality, and careless breeding, because such practices would not produce a strong, healthy race. If Black women were forced to be the breeders of future generations of slaves before the Civil War, in the decades after, they were determined to take control of their own households, moral education, and reproductive life in an effort to nurture the best qualities of body and soul. Conclusion. The society and economy of the antebellum slave South rested on both the production and reproduction of the slave population. Black Americans and their white, mostly former abolitionist allies, remembered this combination of production and reproduction in dark terms indeed. The reproductive manipulation of the slaves, particularly enslaved women, produced what many felt had been unnatural and ungodly relations between masters and slaves. The African-American writer and civil rights activist Archibald Grimke made this point in typically colorful terms when he insisted that slavery is a breeding bed, a sort of compost heap, where the best qualities of both races decay and become food for the worst. The brute appetites and passions of the two act and react on the moral nature of each race with demoralizing effects. From an African-American perspective, placing such characterizations of slavery in popular culture demonstrated how coercion and dominance, not paternal reciprocity, as the historical narratives of white Americans so often claimed, characterized the reality of slave life. In other words, Black and white abolitionists, former slaves, and an increasing class of African-American intellectuals viewed the political economy of the slave South as a moral perversion of an otherwise free and democratic republic. They argued, as the African-American writer Francis L. Hunter asserted, that many people purchased Negro women because they were good breeders, making large fortunes by selling their children. This compulsory breeding naturally crushed the maternal instincts in Negro women. African Americans recalled that in slavery, the best and worst elements of the white population, from the aristocratic slaveholders down to the white trash slave traders and overseers, contributed to a system that violently manipulated the reproductive lives of the enslaved and tore families apart. In Freedom, as Henry Clay Bruce observed in overly optimistic language, the better class at the South will soon see the errors of their past conduct, while the white trash will be drawn to the mobs of stake burners and lynchers. As we will see, Bruce's premonition became a tragic and bloody reality. He made only one error. In Freedom, as in slavery, the best classes of Southern whites united with the white trash to terrorize Black Americans in body and soil. As Black America's intelligentsia came to insist, slavery's violent and sexually exploitative legacy lived on both in African American memories and in daily interactions with the white world around them. So that's the end of chapter 2, another powerful chapter in this very interesting, fascinating book. Black history and slave breeding in the early 20th century is what we will be reading next in chapter 3 tomorrow. Want to give a shout out to everybody who jumped into the live stream chat. Brian C., KL, and Avery Adams as well. Y'all be easy out there. And if you have any other books you want me to review, put them in the comments and we'll try to get to it.